Hello, everybody, and welcome to to our keynote session with Professor Patrick Jagoda. So, Patrick Jagoda is William Rainey Harper Professor of Cinema and Media Studies, English and Obstetrics and Gynecology at the University of Chicago, and he is the chair of Cinema and Media Studies and executive director of critical inquiry and director of the Western Game Lab. So now, Patrick's books include Network Aesthetics, The Game Worlds of Jason Rohrer in 2026, with Michael Meisels, Experimental Games, Critique, Play, and Design in the Age of Gamification, 2020, and also another book, Transmedia, Stories, Narrative Methods for Public Health and Social Justice, 2022, with Iresia Bennett and Ashlyn Sparrow. And he has also published over 50 essays in interviews in many well-respected journals. So Patrick in general designs transmedia, digital, and analog games, including the climate change alternate reality game Terrarium in 2019, which received the 2020 Indicade Award for the best location-based and live play design. And so he's also a recipient of a 2020 Guggenheim Fellowship. So my name is Stylianos Mistakidis, and I'm a general chair in iLRN2025. And this session will have a duration of 1 hour, during which you are more than welcome to use the chat and the Q&A session of the webinar to submit your questions or remarks if you have. And then during the Q&A after Patrick's talk, we'll engage in a lively dialogue. Also, if you prefer, you are also very much welcome to raise your hand and ask to speak, and also address in voice as you want. So, with that being said, Patrick, the floor is yours. We're very much looking forward to your talk.
Thank you so much for that really generous introduction, and thank you everyone for being here. Sorry that I have to be remote. I'm usually in Chicago, but am teaching remotely at Cornell University for a few weeks now. And again, thank you to many of the organizers who aren't here, whom I've been in conversation with for quite a while. And I'll start there. So I'm a game designer in addition to being a media theorist and many other things. But one thing worth pointing out is that the game industry is enormous, right? These are 2021 numbers, which put the game industry at about 200 billion. A large part of that is mobile, in addition to kind of console, PC, Mac kind of games. It's larger than the book industry, the film and entertainment industry, which includes things like streaming, and of course the recorded music industry, which is smaller. In fact, these numbers are much larger now in 2025 than they were 4 years ago, but this gives you a sense of scale. In particular, I'm not interested in this talk in the broader game industry. I'm interested in the serious games movement, which was looking at games designed for a primary purpose outside of pure entertainment. And so we have many games that fall into the realms of education or advocacy. So games around surgery, or critiques of neocolonialism, or games about biodiversity, or games about conflicts in the Middle East, for instance, to name a few of the ones on the screen here. But there are also games that are more traditionally aligned with school curricula. Games in general, not just video games, have many affordances, many benefits, right? So they depend on a visceral or emotional logic. They garner curiosity, motivation, and optimism for completing a challenge. So they kind of put you in a flow state, which isn't boring and isn't terrifying either. It's in between in this very happy and motivating way. They activate multiple learning styles, right? Games have text, image, sound, also interactivity. So they meet many different kinds of learners where they're at. They promote social and interpersonal learning. They enable safe failure, right? You can make mistakes and try again, which is important and increasingly rare given the economic drive of the world. They also provide a way into difficult topics and much else, which I'll kind of talk about as I go on. So in this talk, I want to kind of start by thinking about models of learning and literacy that I've worked through many different fields, including game design and media making, public health, and education. So I'll give you some models, and then I'll talk about cases where we've actually tried to test or implement those models in one way or another across those disciplines. And finally, I'll make an argument about world making versus skill building, basically, through these kinds of educational games. So I'll start with game design and media making. So, many educational games focus on the direct delivery of information. This goes back to well-known historical examples like Math Blaster and Reader Rabbit in the United States. These games often looked a lot like interactive quizzes, right? They used what was called around that time a chocolate-covered broccoli approach to game design, which took information that might be boring and tried to make it engaging by combining it with games, right? There's a time and a place for these kinds of games, but sometimes they fail to engage learners. And why is it that information-oriented educational games don't always hit their mark? Well, I think there are at least 3 reasons. One is that games with direct learning content may trigger psychological defenses and reduce player engagement. So in other words, they seem too didactic. Second of all, psychological research suggests that being better informed does not necessarily lead to beneficial outcomes. So for instance, the researcher Robert Cialdini has demonstrated that making the prevalence of undesirable behaviors such as littering more salient to individuals sometimes increases the likelihood of them committing the same action. So such prohibitions can promote the desire to transgress or even make a problematic action like littering, like throwing around waste, seem more common and therefore more acceptable. And then third of all, information-focused environments can yield less engagement, right? There have been studies at places like MIT that have shown that there's the least arousal and engagement in cognition when it comes to things like watching television and being in a traditional lecture. So the idea is to get beyond those conventional models. One of the models that I've been working with as a designer for some time comes from Geoff Kaufman and Mary Flanagan. And they've proposed this kind of alternative approach to game design that they call embedded learning or embedded design. And they found that basically serious pro-social and learning games can be more effective if they're less overt and less obviously message-driven. So they propose a series of design methods that they call intermixing, obfuscating, embodied cognition, priming, strategic inversion, and much else. So I'll give you a couple examples of this. So one of Kaufman and Flanagan's design concepts is called intermixing, and this involves combining on-topic and off-topic game content to make the focal message or theme less obvious and more accessible. So their case study for this is a card game called Awkward Moments, which is an apples-to-apples style party game about gender bias in STEM fields. So they found that participants who played a version of this game that embedded gender bias scenarios alongside ordinary awkward moments showed a much stronger anti-bias response compared to participants who played a much more didactic version of that game. A second concept is that of obfuscation. So this involves using game genres or framing of devices that direct players' attention or expectations away from the game's true aims. So this was a game called Buffalo, the name-dropping game. And this was a game about social identity, stereotypes, and again, inherent bias. So the game diverts the player's attention from its ultimate message. But the researchers found that the game effectively promoted broader and more conclusive perceptions of social groups and raised player concerns about their own potential bias. So this is more effective by obfuscating the message from plain sight. So we've worked with a few of these methods in our own games. So back in 2016, for instance, we made a prototype called The Test, which was a theory-based mobile game prototype designed to promote HIV testing by providing information and influencing motivations and behavioral intentions among groups that particularly were at risk of HIV. So we built around 4 reasons that people don't get tested, right? And those include a lack of urgency about HIV testing. It includes a lack of knowledge about insurance coverage in the United States. Third of all, it includes a fear of possible homophobia among physicians and staff for LGBTQ participants in particular. And then also feelings of disconnection within a weak social network. So we took those ideas and we mixed on-message content with non-focal content and game genres that were a little bit different. Another example is we took this idea of strategic inversion that Kaufman and Flanagan put forward, and we created a board game called Smokestacks, which was an anti-smoking board game. But in this game, you play as a tobacco company, and you try to get as many people addicted to your product as you possibly can. And through play testing, we found this was actually much more effective and exciting to players than putting them in the position of smokers or potential smokers. And in this game, at first, players succeed in getting a larger market, but by the end, they see their customers dying. And so there's a kind of procedural rhetoric that shows how harmful tobacco can actually be. Anyway, so that's one of the methods. Another method that I use in media making is probably very well known to you. It's participatory design. So participatory design and culture was a term defined and popularized by the media scholar Henry Jenkins. So in a 2007 white paper, Jenkins and his colleagues defined participatory culture as, quote, a culture with relatively low barriers to artistic expression and civic engagement, strong support for creating and sharing one's creations, and some type of informal mentorship whereby what is known by the most experienced is passed along to novices. Moreover, such a culture is one in which members believe their contributions matter and feel a degree of social connection with one another. So admittedly, the term participatory culture has related antecedents in educational reform and radical theories going back to people like Paulo Freire, Seymour Papert, and bell hooks, among others. But the concept of participatory culture, which gained much of its initial energy in educational changes around the mid-20th century and found extensions through technological developments in the late 20th century, has had this kind of dialectical synthesis in digital media and learning initiatives in our time, in the early 21st century. So during these years, scholars early on like Mitsuko Ito and scholar practitioners like Nicole Pinkard deepened and popularized the field of media-embedded participatory learning. And many others have as well. There have been critiques of participatory learning as well, about access, for instance, but those are ones that I've tried to work through and around in our cases. So I'll give you an example of one case that we created in my Transmedia Story Lab. This was a project called Southside Speculations, and it was a 2-year workshop that I developed with researchers and graduate students at the University of Chicago and also at the University of Illinois, Chicago, including Jenny Breyer, who is another PI on this project. This program took place between 2018 and 2019 and was supported by the Mellon Foundation. So in order to garner a more heterogeneous and plural vision of alternative futures, we asked high school students to use historical and media work to lay the foundations for speculative narratives about Black and brown folks. So we started with an education around BIPOC futurisms. We watched media and read texts that had to do with Afrofuturism in particular. And then together we worked to make media in a participatory way where students learned from experts in the field, but were ultimately responsible for their own set of media projects. And our bigger prompt for the second year of this project was, what will the future of the South Side of Chicago look 30 years from now? And the South Side of Chicago, for those of you who are not from the city, is predominantly Black and isn't imagined as often in kind of futuristic visions. And part of the reason for this is racism, but also it's a focus on the global or the individual scale of imagination. And so in this project, we wanted to shift to the neighborhood scale, which is this kind of mid-level scale. So what does a neighborhood like Woodlawn or Englewood in Chicago look like 30 years from now? And we asked our students to create a series of short speculative films that were about 3 to 4 minutes long based on their topical research and their object designs. And so we worked with them on speculative design projects back when I didn't have blue hair, I suppose, and created a series of short films. And the final portion of Southside Speculations happened several months afterwards through a series of exhibitions. And we did these in the Arts Incubator, which is a space created by the Black artist Theaster Gates in order to promote community-based arts projects and exhibitions. We also moved that exhibition to the African American Cultural Center Gallery at the University of Illinois in Chicago. And this was a way that the students could get even more invested in what they were doing, because suddenly there was a community context that exceeded the content that they were learning in the first instance. And across these events, youth participated and they joined adult speakers and facilitators for questions and dialogue. So they themselves could become experts on the content and the projects that they had created. Also, this gave them experience and things that they could put on their resume for the future. So there was a kind of practical component to the project. Okay, so the second thing I want to talk about is public health as a field. So this is a different discipline, a different approach. So the two models I work with in public health on some projects are, first of all, the socio-ecological model. So SEM is a framework that helps understand how individuals are influenced by multiple levels of their environment, including the individual, interpersonal, organizational, community, and policy levels. So it's essentially a networked way of thinking. Another approach from public health, or that gets used in public health, that I use quite often is positive youth development. So positive youth development is an approach to working with youth that focuses on building their strengths and providing opportunities for them to reach their full potential rather than solely addressing problems. So it emphasizes empowering young people, developing their assets, fostering positive relationships to support healthy, productive lives. And we were already using this in a project like the one I just spoke about, the Southside Speculations, but another one that was very key to this was called Hexacago Health Academy. And the 1.0 of this took place between 2015 and 2020. The 2.0 took place between 2020 and actually this year, 2025. Our NIH grant ended earlier this year. So as part of this project, we used this board that we call the Hexacago board that was a kind of abstract representation of the city of Chicago. And we actually did versions of this for Los Angeles, for Austin, for London, for other kinds of places. And it was a way of connecting young people to the place that they live and the networked elements of that place. And we basically paired young people with mentors. So we used elements of youth-initiated mentoring in what we did, where people could identify mentors who could help them through a particular subject area. And basically the curriculum involved 1 week of public health education, 1 week of game design training, so focusing on content, then on form. And then the third week was a workshop where young people would develop a series of board games around topics like gun violence, drugs and alcohol, smoking, sexually transmitted infections. So a variety of different public health topics, often put in a kind of social and political frame. And they would mock up these games that we would later turn into kind of more professional builds of some of the same content. So they created games like Clinic Quest, for instance, and like Smokestacks, which we talked about before. That ended up being a professional game that started with conversations in essentially this kind of summer camp. So one benefit of working with board games here was that it was a kind of world making that didn't depend on programming. So access was much easier. It still takes time to learn how to make a board game and how to balance it, but it isn't as challenging as making a video game from the ground up. The third area that I want to talk about a little bit is education. So this is a field that I think is more familiar and more at home for many people at this conference, though I think people are coming from many different fields. So you can correct me on many things in this area in particular. So two frameworks that I've worked with here. One comes from Ken Bigger, who's one of the organizers of this conference, and he talks a little bit about civic fluency. He says that civic fluency is a person's ability to navigate the various components of adult life and community with competence. It enables individuals empowered with these capacities to function effectively in family life, the arts, citizenship, the workplace, healthcare, and other aspects of full adult human life lived in community. It incorporates the capacity for lifelong learning and the pursuit of educational goals. So here, again, you have this kind of ecological approach to literacy, right? It isn't just reading and writing. It involves using technologies. It involves access to healthcare. It involves getting through one's everyday life. And this is a framework that I like very much to incorporate into some of our games. The other framework, which is very loose, but resonates with many of these frameworks. I'm giving you many similar frameworks in part to show that different fields are doing some very similar work, even if they use different terms for some of this. So the idea with 21st century literacies is, again, to move beyond only reading and writing. 21st century literacies emphasize things like creativity, critical thinking, collaboration, communication and difference, and also things like information literacies and media literacies. So these are, you could say, transferable skills that move beyond, say, mathematics or English or transnational language work as well. So I'll give you a different kind of case here that we worked on that was about civic literacy and incorporated 21st century literacies. This is a very recent and in fact ongoing project. So this was a text-based role-playing video game called Haven that used both asynchronous and synchronous elements to enable first-year undergraduate students at the University of Chicago to practice capacities linked to open discourse, free expression, and the negotiation of difference. So this was an orientation game for over 1,000 incoming undergraduates at the university. And the game was not an educational game in the traditional sense. Instead, it focused on knowledge and information, and we imagined this kind of broader civic environment. Students, over the course of a couple of months, could explore one of 4 islands that were linked to different divisions of knowledge. So the humanities, the arts, the social sciences, and the sciences, which included both physical and biological sciences. However, matters of lifelong learning community were integrated across these islands so that players thought about forming collaborative relationships, negotiating states of dissensus that didn't yield consensus, and embracing various forms of difference. Basically, skills they would need to succeed at college and then later to succeed at their careers as well. And this was a game about persuasion, but also mutual understanding. It moved beyond reading and writing. It focused on stories, cultural traditions, puzzle solving, and interactivity in this kind of broader world that students would explore together. So I'm going to show you just a brief video to give you a sense of what this looked like, since we have a little bit of time, and this may give you just a better sense of what this looks like.
Oh, yes.
So that just gives you a little bit of a sense of what the game looked like. As you could tell, many different disciplines went into this, so this was a deeply interdisciplinary game. I should also say that the game was co-created with a series of undergraduates, about 12 undergraduates, well, including one high school student even, who gave us a kind of vertical integration into the design process. And it was led by Ashlyn Sparrow, who's one of my wonderful collaborators and a really great game designer. Happy to talk more about that process or that game afterwards. So I want to end by making a broader argument at the end of this talk. So learning games that privilege world making over skills acquisition, I think, yield better educational outcomes. While we often think of worlds as immersive and consistent, I also want to consider the ways that games are, or worlds are self-reflexive loops, have frame breaks, and even jagged moments across media that can spur different kinds of learning, right? Worlds are filled with difference and they're not always immersive and smooth. So maybe I'm like playfully pushing against that word immersive, which is key to this conference and quite important. So one of the forms that I've worked with for a long time that I think is organized around worlds is this form of alternate reality games. And these games are basically narrative-driven scavenger hunts that take place both online and in person. They include physical performance, almost like theater. They involve online puzzles, and they're this kind of Frankensteinian hodgepodge of different forms that also, I think, makes them more accessible in a design process if you're not working with a lot of resources, as I'm sure none of us are. These games also engage in collaborative storytelling instead of the individual completion of a game. They're transmedia rather than multimedia. When I think of something as multimedia, I think of it as happening on a single screen, like a standard video game, versus transmedia being something that moves you across different platforms and different media forms and calls your attention to the differences and the different affordances of each of those forms. So it engages in kind of media literacy. These games also promote creation instead of reverse engineering an algorithm. Like when you play a lot of video games, you're just reverse engineering what the designer created in order to beat a level or something like that. These games promote making among the people who are part of this world and co-making this world together. I also really like alternate reality games because they engage in this kind of intentional slippage among a game, a community, a curriculum, a platform, a narrative, and a world. So they're kind of one of my ideals of what an education could look like. The case I'm going to end with is Scene. This was a game that a few of us, Heidi Coleman, Ashlyn Sparrow, Mark Downey, co-designed for 350 middle school students in 3 Southside Chicago schools, one public, one charter, one private. We intentionally wanted schools with different resources to think about how such a game could work there. This game, again, happened both in person and online, and it was organized around environmental science and climate change. So it was a way of building up a climate change curriculum. And lasted for about 2.5, 3 weeks in all, 2 weeks of very intensive playing. So I'll just show you, again, a very short clip of a longer documentary to give you a sense of what this game looked and felt like, but in particular to end with this idea of a world as being an optimal way of foregrounding context in the midst of immersive learning and literacy. So I'll play just a few minutes of this.
It's a secret to all the kids.
There's not just one reality, there are many realities.
We're getting these messages from the forecast lab.
And we're like, oh my gosh, what is this?
I've never really seen something like this, no pun intended.
Scene is an alternate reality game.
It's like a knowledgeable game.
Games are structures for play. Play is a way of creating transformation.
I'm getting full engagement from every student.
I think it's been giving the students a lot of opportunities to create, design, and also problem solve.
Scene is pretty much like an adventure.
While doing these quests, you're like learning about climate change.
It's good to explore all these possibilities of the future.
The key to the future is the present.
Climate change is arguably the most pressing issue of our time.
I hate it. I hate climate change.
It doesn't just have to do with rising temperatures, it has to do with increased food shortages, sea level rise, which is going to cause serious flooding, a rise in climate refugees and structural inequality, and the loss of biodiversity.
It has the potential to wipe out the human race.
Middle school is the exact time when students should start learning about climate change.
You have to be really careful when you approach the subject that you want to make sure you give them a sense of hope.
SEED begins with a call to action. It begins with a video from the Forecast Lab.
Every few days, the keepers will reveal one of their many possible future worlds, both from the near and far future. The more quests you complete as a group, the more of that world you'll see.
A member of the Forecast Lab will record a video to frame that world for you, so you're prepared for it.
After that, the first 20 quests will become available. Your team will have about 2 days to finish as many of those quests as you can.
If we are able to complete the Keeper's game, we just might have a shot at stopping the darkness.
Students have to decide which worlds they're willing to sacrifice in order to save others. So we had Edwin Kite talking about a future of terraforming the moon.
People living in 2217 must have really run out of options.
We had Tiffany Shaw in the geophysical sciences talking about a water future that had extreme sea level rise.
Even in our version of Earth, coastal cities like Miami and Florida are at serious risk of going underwater.
We had Sabina Sheikh from the program on global environment talking about a non-human future in which humans didn't exist anymore.
But there's so many existential threats, like climate change, that could lead to mass extinction and wipe out the human race.
We're putting University of Chicago faculty in front of middle schoolers to serve as role models.
Working with the University of Chicago has given them a lot of opportunities to just open up their minds on what science is.
So I'll stop there. The video continues, but I want to make sure we have time for Q&A. I'll just say that we had about 350 students total across the 3 schools playing this game. And they ended up completing in small teams. They were in, I think, teams of 3 or 4 for this. And they completed nearly 2,500 quests. And a quest could be anything from writing a 250-word essay to making a short video to recording a song about sea level rise. So it combined creative skills with content and vocabulary skills. So you might have to write a song about the word Anthropocene. And of course, to do that, you would have to understand a little bit about the history and the meaning of the concept of Anthropocene in order to do that. We really engaged media literacy, but not in a direct way, in this indirect way, by using leaderboards and team-based play, and a lot of collaboration as well. This wasn't a primarily competitive game. So anyway, this gives you a little bit of a sense of one model of the way that I think about world building as a way of moving forward with education. And again, I want to leave you with this idea that immersion does not always require a lack of transparency about the meta approach of a curriculum, right? To be immersed doesn't mean to be to shut the outside world out as you're doing something. Sometimes it means moving through transparency and through hypermediation, which is so central to our media environments now, right? It also can mean learning to negotiate the boundaries of a magic circle. And I think this is an important part of being literate in this era of increased misinformation, disinformation, and constant movement among media and platforms, right? A game is a magic circle that you enter into. It's its own time and space, but there's no reason that one can't think about the movement in and out of immersion as a way of becoming a more civically minded citizen of this world and a better learner. And then I think specifically alternate reality games help students develop broader context literacy. I've been making these for about 15 years now. These games combine the frameworks I've discussed today, so embedded design, participatory design, socio-ecological model, positive youth development, civic fluency, and 21st century literacies. I also think that worlds resonate with contemporary culture. I mean, think about how often that term world making gets used, or transmedia world making, or story worlds, or multiverses, which in Marvel or something are are also a way of thinking. So they're attractive to students, if nothing else, right? They bring them into something where students are willing to do these quests and play this thing because it's a game and it doesn't look like the traditional lecture model that they're accustomed to. So I'm going to end there, but I'll just say that I develop a lot of these ideas out with some of my collaborators, including Ashlyn Sparrow and Irisha Bennett, in this book from 2023, Transmedia Stories, Narrative Methods for Public Health and Social Justice. And this book focuses a little bit on games, but also on narrative. And it's open access. It's completely online, and you can find it in transmediastories.org. It's a Stanford University Press book. It includes videos, case studies, interactive timelines, in case folks are interested in some of these projects and want to kind of recreate their own versions in one way or another. So I will end there and stop sharing, but I am happy to have a conversation and talk more about any of this. Thank you for sharing that link.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Patrick, for this exciting journey across many different projects and frameworks, connecting also with the central topic of our conference as well. So, any remarks, questions from all of you that are here with us online? Right. Okay. So we have Daphne, who is asking that if building game worlds leads to better learning than just teaching skills, how can designers balance that with the need to meet specific curriculum goals, especially in schools where there's pressure to assess and measure everything?
Thank you for that question, Daphne. I think, and thank you for asking the first question as well from a distance. I think that's a very real concern, right? I don't want to be utopian about what I would like education to look like, because we all have our own versions of this. We often have to teach to tests or to outcomes. I mean, even the undergraduates that I teach, right, I'm thinking a lot about career outcomes for them after college. But this is very true for our middle school, high school students. So what I would say is that embedded design is maybe the best method that I have for this, right? We always start with learning outcomes. In fact, we, as designers, always come up with a list, often in collaboration with content experts, to figure out, like, what exactly do you want folks to learn? Is it vocabulary? Is it capacities or skills? Is it broader exposure? And then we slowly try to, like, hide some of those things within the game, right? So if, like, one of the outcomes is learning about CO2 emissions and what CO2 is, well, instead of having a flashcard style quiz, we would incorporate the idea of CO2 many times into the story. Sometimes it might get defined, sometimes it might be used in a broader context, but I would argue that that oftentimes leads to better recall, because there's a deeper understanding of it, right? So you can teach to the test, that's sometimes necessary, but also for longer term learning, sometimes this embeddedness can be effective. So I really recommend that Kaufman and Flanagan piece that I've learned a lot about and kind of written about in other contexts, like HIV education, for instance.
Right, thank you very much. And I've seen there's also another question. So here she says that I was really engaged in the session because I have a deep interest in the educational application of games. As you mentioned early on, I've often seen that when educational content is too explicit, or when the purpose of the game is clear educational, it actually lowers student engagement. Even when the game is fun and well designed with solid game elements, students often respond with, are you trying to teach me something? Ew. And their motivation drops. That's something I've struggled with a lot. So I really appreciate seeing a more nuanced approach to gamification today, one that goes beyond simply using content and instead focuses on helping students build a variety of competencies through well thought out design. So
great,
very nice comment.
I'm happy to respond to that. That's very nice. And yeah, I think, you know, in addition to traditional games, like, we've been very invested in performance, right? That's not true of the board game projects in some of the video game projects, but that final alternate reality game was an example of bringing in live actors. So we actually used live streaming as a way of doing this. We also pre-built some of the game, but we left gaps where we could basically respond to what players were doing. And one idea of a world, right, is that it's not just given to you. It's not just something that you experience in a linear, pre-designed format, which is what many single-player video games amount to. Worlds are dynamic, right? They're constantly shifting and being made through co-storytelling and through inhabitation. And so we like to make these worlds feel alive by learning about our players over the course of several weeks, right? These are longer games than your traditional board games, and incorporating some of that knowledge and some of those interests back into the game. And one thing that I've found is that players, students, are become excited. They feel seen when they see something of them showing up in the game, and that actually increases their motivation, because it no longer feels like this is just like a given interactive quiz. Suddenly it's like, wow, these people who are making this game might actually care about us, which all of us do about our students. It's just a matter of getting through these requirements that all of us have, like teaching to the test, as Daphne was suggesting.
All right, very well. Here's another question from the chat. What do you see as the biggest opportunity and the biggest risk in applying gamification to education today?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, one of the biggest risks is over-focusing on extrinsic motivation and not intrinsic motivation. So I said, for instance, in some games, we use leaderboards or we use points. That has a limited payout. Like, I don't think that it's a terrible thing to do. There are students who are highly motivated by wanting to be at the top of a leaderboard. I mean, think about like Duolingo or many apps that use similar kinds of methods. But I think that over-focusing on extrinsic motivation leads students to be competitive and to be very short-sighted in why they're doing something. Whereas if you get them invested in a story, like, oh, that's a good story, I want to know the ending of it, or in a shared world, like, I want to be part of the social group, like, this has value to me inherently or intrinsically, I find that that works more effectively. I have another book before the Transmedia Stories one that's more theoretical. I mean, it's more kind of a humanistic argument. It's called Experimental Games, and part of the book is a critique of the kind of economic model of gamification that builds on things like economic game theory and even behavioral economics. And I think, again, it's not that that never has positive results, but I think it has limited results. And the intrinsic thing is harder to pull out, but that's why the chocolate-covered broccoli approach doesn't entirely work beyond a point, right? You want to be collaborating with game designers who are actually artists about what they do, right? They have a deeper understanding of not just how to make a game, but how to make a game that is engaging and meaningful in some ways, because I think meaning is the thing in this life that motivates us more than anything else, not just in education.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much. And now thinking also about, as you said, about the game design process, I'm wondering whether you can also share a little bit about your process. For example, how do you decide the format, and how you continue? So, what can you share about this with us, please?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's so we use a lot of what I would describe as a human-centered design process, right? It involves, yes, doing a little bit of research. Like if we have a problem, let's say HIV testing, like why don't people test? Or climate change, which is a larger, wicked problem. We think about like, what are some of the causes of these kinds of problems? So with HIV testing, I talked a little bit about that. With climate change, it's trickier because it's so big, but a lot of it is a kind of social and political problem, right? It has to do not with like the science of it. It has to do with changing behaviors and becoming bought into this kind of radical change of using renewable energies and much else. And so we do a little bit of research. We also talk to our stakeholders. Sometimes we do that before we apply for a grant. Sometimes we do that after, but we try to involve the target demographic as much as possible in the game design process, right? With games, you don't want to be too much in your own head, right? You want to create a model and have people test it and break it. They are always going to break it. Like there's no question about it. The first 10 versions are not going to go well, and you just have to have like a hard heart and be like, okay, I'm going to redesign this, and be open to a lot of critique. So that's one way. But I do think the question of like, what is the best form of game for the topic that you're dealing with, that's a really important design question. So if I'm making a game about epidemiology, about viruses, for instance, I could make a first-person shooter if I wanted to. I could have the player walk around and shoot at viruses, but what is that going to teach them? It might be engaging, but it seems like the wrong form for what it is that you're trying to teach them. In fact, a board game that is more kind of like ecological network and shows the kind of spread of viruses might be more effective in teaching that kind of lesson. And in our case, it was also a question of accessibility. Like we wanted to include people so that they would learn about public health, not so that they would become game designers. And so we didn't have the resources for like, you know, a 2-month video game design camp where you were learning deep technical skills, but we could teach them the design of board games that they could later translate into other forms if they wanted to do that. And it seemed like an appropriate way of going about public health education. So those are just a couple of examples there.
Okay, that's all very helpful. But now comes the really hard question. So are you ready? So first of all, I mean, all these topics and all these challenges, fascinating, highly relevant, globally a priority. But what about the everyday teacher in a school that has a specific curriculum and has specific subjects and so on? What elements or what processes from this approach, which is fantastic and very appealing, can be transferred to the practice of an everyday teacher or everyday school? And having said that, here's a bonus question: do you think there is a way that teachers can become designers, so for example, of alternate reality games or other kinds of things? Do you think this is possible? So, what do you think about this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, look, I understand that I'm at like a private university and I'm a weirdo who has blue hair and makes strange games, right? So the question of like how does this work in everyday classrooms? I mean, I think there are a few different ways, right? Like one is there are some great educational games out there. Like we even distribute some of our board games, but there are many other kind of video games, board games that one could bring into the classroom that are already built. And that's just a matter of taste and preference and subject matter for any given teacher. I also think some of the methods around board game design, we've built them so that they could be implemented in everyday classrooms. In fact, we have online, if you look up Chicago Health Academy, if you look up CI3, we've published some of our curricula that give you a sense of maybe how to take a version of what we did with subject matter and game design and incorporate that into your own classroom. So we've tried to be very transparent with our methods, not just with our outcomes and the kind of final game. So I think that's at least one model to follow, and there are other kind of game design textbooks out there that could be helpful. I've seen teachers run scavenger hunts. I've seen them run like mini alternate reality games that last over a week or even a single day in a classroom that might be analog, right? They might not use any technology whatsoever and might just hide puzzles within a room. And I think there's nothing wrong with analog, right? Like I only use technology when I think it's going to be useful. I don't think it's a good idea to fetishize it, to treat it as a panacea. I think it's important to know about because it's part of our world, but it isn't the correct solution to everything. And so the other piece of advice that I would have for teachers outside of getting already existing games or building your own kind of analog games is also collaborating with people who are game designers, right? There are people out there who don't know your subject matter as well as you do, who haven't been teaching as long as you have. I mean, I've worked with people in like the geophysical sciences or in epidemiology or in public health. Those are not my areas of study first and foremost, but I can learn something from them in terms of how do you teach and what do you want taught? And I can bring something to the table with my team of making a certain kind of game. That's obviously, time dependent. So you want to find someone who has enough of an interest, who wants to collaborate and has the time. But for instance, the 3 teachers we worked with at these middle schools, like they weren't game designers. Like 1 or 2 of them had an interest in games, but they were willing to say like, okay, you can take over 2 weeks of our class. I mean, this was a lot of trust. You can take over 2 weeks of our class. We'll work with you a little bit. We didn't expect them to put in a lot of additional work. We know how overworked teachers are. And this wasn't about creating additional work for them. But that ended up being a really effective collaboration where we had access to their classrooms, to their students, to their knowledge. They had access to our time, our game design knowledge, and things like that. So I hope some of that helps that question.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Very helpful. And now moving over to the digital domain, as we said, which is absolutely not obligatory. And I'm also, we are also huge proponents of analog or unplugged gamification in education. So here comes the final and let's say also obligatory question, the AI question. So how do you envision AI reshaping eventually the way that we design or experience educational games, and also possible implications for AI and world making and alternate reality games?
Yeah. I mean, one thing to say, right, is that AI has been influencing game design for a very long time. Like, even the earliest chess playing simulations were already using very early versions of AI systems. Early video games, like arcade games in the 1970s, also had like very basic AI, like pathfinding systems, bosses who had like certain pattern behaviors, right? All of that was a form of AI. So this is just to say that the current generative AI phase, which has lasted for about the last 10 years, is a slightly different development, though one that's obviously impacted us as educators quite a bit. I started working with a working group at the University of Chicago to think about the relationship between creativity and AI. And we're proposing kind of a series of small prototypes that would help us think about that interaction. And so one of those prototypes that I would love to build if we end up getting the funding is incorporating AI into live performance, right? So what would it mean to use even a model of ChatGPT that could be a co-actor or an audience member within an interactive theater performance? Now this seems very specialized, but I think it has a lot of potential applications because if so much of learning is play, and I really think of learning at its best as being a form of play, then thinking about the way that AI can be playful can be really important as well. I know there are a lot of risks for AI. I mean, there's like the risks of plagiarism, of students generating essays instead of actually writing them. These are challenges we all have to face. But I also think of AI sometimes operating the way that search engines did years ago, right? When Google or Yahoo or various search engines came into being, people were very concerned about what this would do to knowledge, Wikipedia even, right? And those were well-founded fears also. But think about how incorporated this is into the way that we think now, right? The problem with AI, of course, is that there's a lot of misinformation there. Like, I found out that I've published many works that I haven't even published, right? So there's things like that. So it isn't quite optimized, and that's one of its dangers. But I think there are ways that AI can be helpful as a tool as long as students don't become overly dependent on it. So I like to think about an AI as a collaborator within gameplay and maybe to some degree game design, but there's a lot of work left to be done to optimize those systems, I think, to make them actually usable. But it is something that I want to learn about. I had a very strong, like, oh, I don't want to deal with this response when generative AI was first becoming available, but then it just, there's no way around it, and it actually isn't, there are things that are very scary about it, but I think that there are also things that are very ordinary about it that we need to learn how to critique and have a meta about, but that we can also use as tools.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you very much, Patrick, for this highly engaging and very stimulating cognitively session and talk for everyone. And for everyone, thank you very much for your active participation and for your insightful questions in this lively dialogue. So thank you once again, Patrick. Enjoy the rest of the conference. We have the next keynote keynote speech coming up in just 2 minutes on the top of the hour. So see you around. Thank you once again, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you, everyone,
Thank you
and the organizers again for having me. See you all soon.